Our first presentation will be given by Dr. Bethke Elshtain, and she is the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Professor of Social and Political Ethics at the University of Chicago. Her presentation is entitled The Dignity of the Human Person and the New Eugenics. Dr. Elshtain.
Good morning. It's good to see so many of you here on this cold morning. Looks like a day packed with interesting presentations. I want to apologize in advance for the fact that I'm going to have to leave shortly after my own presentation. I have students waiting for me at the University of Chicago today. 2 summers ago, I attended a conference in Berlin, Germany. And the first presentation was by the Lutheran Bishop of Berlin, a man named Wolfgang Huber. And he talked about what he construed as a terrible problem that was emerging in contemporary society, including Germany. Germany with its tragic history, the last century. And that problem he characterized as one of an emerging biological fundamentalism. He argued that, in fact, there were those who seemed to want to create a society in which evaluations were made of people in advance of a person emerging in his or her dignity and in the fullness of time. Judgments were going to be made in advance as to what kind of person one was dealing with based upon a reading of that person's genetic potential. So a kind of genotypic fundamentalism then was a worry that he expressed coming under the rubric of a new wave of eugenics, although no one likes to use that word, as you may know, given its tragic history. Well, I want to submit to you that we need to worry in a way that Bishop Huber suggested that the Germans must, because we are bombarded daily with the promise that nearly every human ailment or condition can be overcome if we just have sufficient will to proceed apace, and if we refuse to listen to entreaties from critics who are invariably represented as against progress, as against choice. Being anti-choice, as you know, is tantamount to being anti-American. So there's a way in which, if you label those who are raising criticisms as against human progress and against choice, you effectively shut down the kind of discussion we really should be having. Now, for those whom philosopher Charles Taylor calls the cultural boosters, our imperfect human embodiment has itself become a problem that we should strive to overcome. And the claims made by promoters and advocates of a quest for genetic perfection often run to the ecstatic. And there is already talk, as some of you may know, about the possibility of designer genes, G-E-N-E-S. Now note in this regard the following advertisement that was reported by the New York Times in the early spring of 1999. This was an advertisement that had appeared in college newspapers all over the United States, and the ad read as follows: egg donor needed, large financial incentive, intelligent, athletic egg donor needed, you must be at least 5 foot 10 inches, have a 1400 SAT score, possess no major family medical issues, $50,000, all expenses paid. And that's the text of the advertisement. Now, Commonweal observed in an editorial occasioned by this advertisement that this brings back eerie reminders of earlier advertisements that involve trade in human flesh. And that ads like this suggest that, in the words of the editorial, we are fast returning to a world where persons carry a price tag and where the cash value of some persons is far greater than that of others, where some lives are more valuable, they are worth more on the open market, if you will, than are other lives. Now, soberer voices, like those, for example, of scientist Doris T. Zalin, find themselves struggling to gain a hearing. She wrote an interesting editorial in the Chronicle of Higher Education a year and a half or so ago, and she noted that the earlier promises of genetic intervention to forestall serious health problems such as sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, and Huntington's disease have thus far enjoyed only the meagerest success. That is, we had all sorts of promises, and thus far, this intervention hasn't measured up. She takes up this booming enterprise and says, not only do we have promises to forestall difficulties, to try to prevent harm, that's one thing, but also now promises that we can attain a kind of biological or genetic perfection. And this is called genetic enhancement. You start with a healthy person and then you move to perfect. Zalin calls this the genetic equivalent of cosmetic surgery. And she writes, the aim is to make people taller, thinner, more athletic, more attractive, because those are traits that we value culturally. And she lists potential harms from this enterprise, including the reinforcement of, in her words, irrational societal prejudices. And she reminds us that the historic record is not encouraging. And she notes earlier efforts in the line of eugenics with terrible outcomes that were also evident, by the way, in this country. We don't know our own history very well in this regard, where policies of involuntary sterilization of persons with mental retardation and other measures went forward apace. And the first wave of eugenics that hit this country at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, the calmer voices in the scientific community remind us that at present we have only a thin understanding of all of the details of genetic instruction, and that this is unsurprising when one considers that a single-celled conceptus immediately after fertilization involves a 100 trillion times miniatured information system. Yet those who claim that the benefits of genetic manipulation are unstoppable, that sort of technological drive that Cardinal George spoke of, are unstoppable and entirely beneficial. They downplay, those who push that direction, make those kinds of arguments, downplay any and all controversies and short-circuit the difficulties. And in this way, they undercut, or they attempt to undercut criticism in a matter that effectively precludes others coming to an independent judgment about these matters. In a way, you move to forestall precisely the kind of discussion we should be having. So it is very difficult to have that discussion, given the way in which it is shut down. And those who try to initiate the discussion, as you know, are often tagged with the label of being opposed to progress. Now, despite this, there are some critical straws in the cultural wind. Let me recommend to you, it's not a very good film, but it's an instructive film, a 1997 film some of you may have seen, called Gattaca, in which the protagonist is born what is called in this futuristic imagining of a society, he's born the old-fashioned way. That's called a faith birth, because his parents take a chance on what sort of child will emerge. And as a result of being born in this old-fashioned and now illicit way, there's a genetic profile that's done on him because he hasn't been genetically vetted in advance of birth. He's a very beautiful child, but it turns out on the genetic standards of the world into which he is born, he is considered a degenerate. And the argument of those who control this society is that cells tell all. They define the person. Precisely that genotypic fundamentalism that Bishop Hubert worried about. As a result, the protagonist in this film, his name is Vincent, he isn't covered by medical insurance, he doesn't get to go to school past a certain age, and he's doomed to a life of menial service. And there are scanners set up all over the place when you're going to enter any public place or a place of business where you put your finger forward and it immediately scans you and it comes up valid or invalid. So he faces life as an invalid, as a degenerate. And in the film, this scenario is played out with some tragic consequences. Well, of course, we're not in that nightmare yet. But the question is, are we drawing anywhere near? Are we drawing anywhere close? And I would say that on the level of some cultural assumptions, we certainly are. Let me share with you a letter that I received, or a portion of a letter that I received, from the mother of a Down syndrome child, who wrote me after she had read a piece that I had written about genetic engineering in the New Republic. And in that piece, I had reflected on what this quest for bodily perfection might mean over the long run for the developmentally different. Now, my interlocutor, the woman who wrote to me, had given birth to a child with Down syndrome. This child had died after a critical illness in his 3rd year. And she wrote to me as follows. She said, "My husband and I are enormously grateful to have had the joyous privilege of parenting a child with Down syndrome. Tommy's birth truly transformed our lives in ways that we will cherish forever. But how could we have known in advance that we possessed the fortitude to parent a child with special needs? And who would have told us of the rich rewards?" And the letter continues, "The function of prenatal tests, despite protestations to the contrary, is to provide parents the information necessary to assure that all pregnancies brought to term are normal. I worry not only about the encouragement given to eliminating a whole category of persons," which is a point I had made, "but also about the prospects for respect and treatment of children who come to be brain damaged either through unexpected birth traumas or later accidents. And what about the pressures to which parents like myself will be subject?" She says, "In effect, we're being presented with the following challenge. How could you choose to burden society in this way?" Now, here's my worry. In the name of expanding choices, strikes me that we are at the same time narrowing our definition of humanity, and along the way, a felt responsibility to create welcoming environments for all children. If we simply declare they chose to have an abnormal child and now they must pay the consequences, this declaration, if it is generalized, takes us as individuals, as a society, off the hook for the purpose of social care and concern for all persons, including those with bodies and minds that are not considered normal. Now, the trend I here note stitches together a cluster of views under the rubric of expanding choice, extending freedom, and enhancing human control over human nature. The end result, and the ideal end result, is the diminution of the sphere of the unchosen and the expansion of the reign of control over our natures. So rather than viewing children who are not normal in their development simply as a type of child who occurs from time to time, who is born among us, and who in common with all children makes a claim on our tenderest affections and most fundamental obligations, we see such children as beset by a fixable condition. There must be a cure. Now, there are some remarkable advances that have been made in fetal surgery, as you know, in correcting certain harms. And as I said, that's an area we could certainly have a discussion about under the rubric of not doing harm. The worry I have is defining what counts as harm, what counts as a harmful condition, defining what counts as an imperfect condition so broadly that we extend the notion, we proliferate the notion of what isn't normal, and then we argue with those situations that are not, if you will, fixable in utero, that those children should simply be eliminated. Because the cure, as you know, is, in many cases, is to gain sufficient knowledge or to claim that you have such knowledge, such that you can predict the outcome of a pregnancy and that you can move to prevent a wrongful birth in the first place. So, the fact that curing Down syndrome means one eliminates a type of human being is no barrier to this effort. And people alive among us with Down syndrome must simply live with the knowledge that the culture's dominant view is that it would be better off were no more of their kind to appear among us. Now, in a recent book called The Future of the Disabled in Liberal Society, an ethical analysis, ethicist Hans S. Reinders, that's spelled R-E-I-N-D-E-R-S, for those who want to take note of it, he argues that despite public policy efforts to ensure equal opportunity and access for all, liberal society, including our own, I'm not talking about debates between Republicans and Democrats, I'm talking about a society structured in and through liberal philosophical presuppositions of public policy. Such a society, he argues, cannot sustain equal regard for persons with disabilities, and that this is especially true if the disabilities in question are mental. This is the way his argument goes. The liberal presupposition, which privileges choice as the primary category in public life and as the apogee of human aspiration, paired with modern technologies of reproductive and genetic engineering, dictate that it would be far better if human persons who are incapable of choosing on this model were not to appear among us. So strong is the prejudice in this direction that we simply assume that hypothetical unborn children with cognitive disabilities would, if they could, choose not to be born. So we make the decision that they, by definition, cannot make, if you will. Reinders argues that the regnant view among liberal philosophers is that human beings with mental retardation may be regarded as members of the human species, but that they lack full moral standing in the secular community. And because they lack such standing, the barriers to eliminating such persons, he worries, will slowly but surely wither away. Now, he says, there are certainly some religious voices that get raised against this possibility. And there is the religious derivation of so much of our ethical thinking. But he fears that that isn't going to be powerful enough to forestall this move to eliminate those with especially cognitive disabilities, because such barriers are under continuous pressure and are likely, he claims, to be bulldozed out of the way by the potent machine of biotechnology backed up by medical authority. So, it is not at all irrational for those with mental disabilities and their families to worry about what the future will hold. The proliferation of genetic testing, Reinders concludes, will most certainly have discriminatory effects because it puts everything under their domain of choice, and parents of children with special needs become guilty of irresponsible behavior in choosing to bear such children and in burdening society with them. Increasingly, we as a society expect and even insist that parents must, because this is the direction that choice takes at present, rid themselves of wrongful life in order to forestall wrongful births that will burden them and, even more importantly, the wider society. And women repeatedly, and I'm sure you have talked to women or you know women of whom this is true, women tell stories of the pressure they have been under from medical caregivers to abort should a sonogram show up something suspicious. The current abortion regime often embodies in practice a burden for women who are told that they alone have the power to choose whether or not to have a child, and that they alone are expected to bear the consequences if they do not choose to do so. The growing conviction that children with disabilities ought never to be born, and that prospective parents of such children ought always to abort, undermines the felt sort of skein of care and responsibility for all children. That, at least, is a reasonable worry, especially when the machinery of technology now surrounding childbirth turns nearly every pregnancy into what was once called a crisis pregnancy. HMOs, as you know, are standardizing prenatal testing and genetic screening procedures that were once called upon only when couples had a history of difficulty. Now, the point of all this is to initiate a process of cajoling and pressuring if there's a presumed difficulty looming that terminates in an abortion. And Jeannie Hanneman, who's a family life minister, sees a cultural shift taking place, moving away from supporting families with special needs children toward resenting such families as creating a burden on society. Well, if you accept this as a characterization of the present moment, accepted in whole, if not in every particular, then I want to suggest the following as a way to continue the discussion. That the heart of the matter lies in a loss of appreciation of the complex nature of human embodiment. The social cultural imagination declares the body to be a construction, something that we can invent and manipulate at will. We are loath, it seems to me, to grant the status of givenness to any aspect of our being, despite the fact, as every parent in this room knows, that human babies are complex, wriggling little bodies that are pre-programmed with all sorts of delicately calibrated reactions to the human relationships that nature, if you will, presumes will be the matrix of child nurture. Now, if we think of bodies concretely in this way, we are propelled to ask ourselves questions about the world these little human bodies enter. Is it a welcoming, warm, responsive world? If we tilt in a radical biotechnological constructivist direction, one in which the body is raw material to be worked upon and worked over, the surround in which bodies are situated fades as an image of the body as a kind of messianic project of our own imaginations looms as the dominant image of the human body. And in this latter scenario, the body we inhabit is the imperfect body that's subject to chance and the vagaries of life, including illness and aging. That body is our foe. I was at a conference 2 years ago in which there was talk about immortalization. The fact that you could find some way to make the RNA, DNA of a particular human being go on sort of forever somehow. It was unclear to me what would emerge. I mean, would this, well, never mind. You can imagine all the different, but immortalization is a word I hadn't heard before. The future perfect body promised by enthusiasts is always represented as a kind of gleaming ideal of our own creation. For soon, we are promised, we will have found a way around the fact that what our foremothers and forefathers took for granted, that the body must weaken and falter and one day pass from life to death, that too will be a relic of a bygone era. This future perfect body is one that will not be permitted to falter. And the argument is that this body may grow older in a strictly chronological sense, but we don't have to age. So we devise multiple strategies to fend off aging. And a recent New York Times Magazine lead article on the recycled generation, some of you may have seen it, extolled, and I'm quoting from the article, the promise of an endless supply of new body parts via stem cell research. And the person writing the article said, alas, we would be there sooner if this research were now not, quote, bogged down in abortion politics, close quote. Now, one of the entrepreneurs who stands to make millions of dollars in what the article calls the scientific chase for the mother of all cells, the embryonic stem cell, bemoans the fact in this article that this rush forward, again, is being slowed down by, quote, knee-jerk reactions on the part of people who react to words like fetal and embryo, close quote. So the image that comes bounding out of that piece is one of genetic innovators who face opposition from superstitious people who go, quote, completely irrational, close quote, when they hear certain words. So these folks are pushing forward in the teeth of sustained opposition But this reverses the actual situation in which we find ourselves. It is the critics of these developments that are in fact fighting a kind of rearguard battle against certain powerful and influential forces who line up with the story that our culture likes to tell about itself, which is a story of unending progress and a gleaming future. Now, I think probably I don't know what my time is like, but I want to say something about cloning, if I may, before. Because that's a controversy that you know is now upon us. I want to say something beginning with this. There was an article in the New York Times, note December 2nd, 1997, under the following headline, "On Cloning Humans, Never Turns Swiftly into Why Not?" And this was an article by their science editor, Gina Kolata. And she pointed out that in the immediate aftermath of the cloning of Dolly, that's the sheep, as you know, there was a lot of concern being voiced about the fact that some irresponsible persons might move to clone a human being, a human person. But, she adds, this opposition dissipated quickly, with fertility centers around the country conducting experiments with human eggs that were laying the groundwork for human cloning, and in fact that the federal government, this is in 1997, was supporting new research on the cloning of monkeys, thereby encouraging scientists to perfect techniques that could be easily transferred, or at least the assumption was they could, to human beings. There was a presidential ethics commission, not the current bioethics commission, headed by Dr. Leon Kass, but an ethics commission then that called for a limited ban on human cloning. But one spokesman for that group said, after all, quote, "It is an American tradition to allow people the freedom to reproduce in any way they like." So cloning becomes just another form of human reproduction. Of course, that claim is false to the historic and legal record. In common with any society of which we have any knowledge, American society has built into its interstices a variety of limitations on reproductive freedom, having to do with age, close relatives, not reproducing, and so on and so forth. But the reigning view of freedom here means doing anything in any way one likes, so cloning becomes just another way some people would choose to reproduce. Now, I submit to you that the fantasies of human cloning are fueled in part by fantasies of predictable self-replication, a kind of radical sameness, a yearning for a world of guaranteed self-replication. Let me read to you a statement from the Pontifical Academy, a statement on human cloning that was issued January 25th, 1997. Human cloning belongs to the Eugenics project and is thus subject to all the ethical and juridical observations that have amply condemned it. As Hans Jonas has already written, cloning is both in method the most despotic and in aim the most slavish form of genetic manipulation. Its objective is not an arbitrary modification of the hereditary material, but precisely its equally arbitrary fixation in contrast to the dominant strategy of nature, close quote. That's from the Pontifical Academy statement. You can read in some of the scenarios of human cloning these strong dreams of wholesale self-possession as we gain more and more control over human reproductive material. It is also convenient to forget, as those who are promoting this possibility do, that it took nearly 300 failed attempts before Dolly the sheep was cloned successfully. We are not told what those failed attempts looked like. We are not told, therefore, what would happen with failed attempts with human beings. What do you do with a failed human clone? How many would there be? Now, Dr. Leon Kass, who is heading up the current presidential bioethics committee or commission, points out that what he calls the technical and meliorist approaches to this issue of cloning all ignore, I'm quoting now, the deeper anthropological, social, and ontological meanings of bringing forth new life. To this more fitting and profound point of view, Cloning shows itself to be a major alteration, indeed, a major violation of our natures as embodied, gendered, and engendering beings, and of the social relationships built on this ground. That's the end of the quote. Now, the upshot, he argues, is that critical interpreters cede the ground too readily to those who want to move full steam ahead, when in fact, as I've already suggested, the burden of the moral argument should fall on those who want to declare the widespread repugnance of human beings about this possibility to be mere superstition or mere timidity. And as a result, and I see that it is time for discussion, so let me conclude. As a result, Cass says we do the following things. We enter a world in which unethical experiments upon resulting children to be are conducted. We enter a world in which we deprive a cloned entity of a distinctive identity, not only because he or she will be in genotype and appearance identical to another human being, but in this case, because he or she may also be twin to the person who is his or her father or mother, if one could still hold them that. And he concludes, we deliberately plan situations that we know are not optimal arenas for the rearing of children. So, to conclude, it seems to me that precisely what we need is the kind of discussion that presumably will go forward here today, in which we challenge some of the reigning cultural presuppositions, we challenge what has been sort of packed under the language of choice and freedom and self-preference. We raise questions that as a society we must raise if we are to think about the dignity of the human person and bring a commitment to that dignity to bear upon the scientific and genetic debates and developments that are proceeding with great rapidity among us. Thank you very much. How much time do we have now? All right, we have about 10 minutes, so I'll be happy to entertain questions. I also, before I stand down, want to tell you something about the two different bills and the Senate having to do with cloning and why you should support one and not the other. But I saw a hand. Yes?
Can you please speak to the possibility of finding maybe unlikely allies across the abortion issue on the issue of cloning?
Well, in fact, some of those unlikely, did you hear the question? The question is about unlikely alliances. That is to say that on this issue of cloning and genetic engineering, you might in fact bring together people who are otherwise divided on the issue of abortion, for example. And in fact, those kinds of alliances are already being forged. There was an essay, and I don't know if it was in the New Republic or the Weekly Standard recently, precisely about that. There are a number of people from the environmental movement, for example, people who have been at the forefront of developments in ecology, ecological theory, and environmental legislation, who in fact are very much opposed to these developments, even as they have been opposed to some other developments in the area of genetic engineering for a period of time. So there's a possibility, and I think one should take advantage of those possibilities, because we are living in a political world where you have to have allies and you have to forge certain kinds of alliances, if you can, in order to forestall some very problematic, to say the least, developments. So I think those alliances, the possibility of those alliances are there. It doesn't mean that people will suddenly come together on some of the issues that deeply divide them. But on this range of issues and questions, I think that possibility exists and indeed is emerging, has emerged. If we look at the kind of testimony, for example, that's been offered before the various subcommittees of both the House and the Senate that are considering these different cloning bills. We had a variety of people testifying that you wouldn't ordinarily think would be at the same table together, who are on the same page on this question at least. So, yes, right here, the gentleman here.
I read about 2 months ago about a development in France where the doctor does not detect abnormality in a fetus, or does detect it and doesn't inform the parents. He he's liable to a suit, civil suit, or he'll have to support that defective child all through his life. Could you clarify that for me?
Well, indeed, that's happened. Did you hear? It's about a bill that, in fact, passed in France that makes a doctor liable for a wrongful birth. That if a child emerges with abnormalities, again, how broadly do we construe an abnormality? I mean, it's just, it's an infinitely elastic category. But at any rate, the doctor then is liable. I don't even think that the parents, in this case, the assumption is that parents will make the doctor liable. I don't think they even have to bring suit. As we ordinarily think of it, I think all they are required to do is to present a piece of scientific or medical evidence that the child is abnormal, and then the medical provider, the obstetrician in this case, becomes liable for the support of this damaged child throughout his or her natural life. As you might suspect, the Catholic Church in France opposed this development, as did a number of other voices from the Jewish community, the Islamic community, all to no avail, because the bill did pass. Questions? Yes, right here.
Would you have any suggestions for how to approach the problem of in vitro fertilization?
Well, that takes us in a slightly different direction, but there it seems to me, so I say slightly different because, of course, pardon? Oh, the question is about in vitro fertilization, and if I have any thoughts, basically, on that. My primary thought, and then there'd be a longer discussion we would have to have with it, but the primary thought is that in vitro fertilization and all the developments in the area of reproductive technology are often considered as sort of separate procedures, entirely detethered, if you will, from the wider sets of concerns that I've talked about. It strikes me that we refract these particular individual cases and developments differently if we situate them within a broader set of ethical and cultural concerns about how we think about the human person, how we think about the dignity of the human person. So you would start at a different place, rather than, as we now do, say, if people have the money. This is very expensive, as you know. If they've got the money and they have the desire to do it, there's no barrier to going forward. It strikes me we would, again, look at it rather differently if we situate that issue within the kinds of concerns that I have talked about. Let me add one other point. When I indicated at the beginning that I was worried about a kind of biological fundamentalism, if you will, that would define people by their genotypic potential, kind of genetic readout, if you will. One question, it's a question I have in my mind, I don't know what the answer to it is, but I've thought about it often. And that is that we've had now, 30 years and so on of discussions within the discourse of feminism about, at its best, it seems to me, a discourse having to do with women as beings of equal dignity, who have many gifts that they have to bring to the wider community. Some women clearly have a strong gift for motherhood, and that is a dignified vocation, something that I think has all too often been forgotten in feminism or even denigrated. There are other gifts that women have. If you set up a situation in which the woman regards herself, or the couple regards themselves as failures on some fundamental level, if they cannot reproduce biologically, then you help to set in motion that dynamic that supports ever more invasive and expensive procedures in order to have your own child. Now, far be it from me to say to people who are in that situation that they ought not to be thinking about this issue. Of course they're going to think about the issue. But there are all sorts of ways, this is the minimal point I would want to make, without adding to the difficulties that particular people have in this area. there are many ways to welcome children into the world. There are many ways to share the life of a child. The society at this point, our society at this point, seems, for example, less and less interested in the question of adoption, what it means to adopt. And one of the reasons that that's so, there have been lots of material on this, about when adoption is suggested as a possibility, people worry that the child might be genetically flawed. There's a concern that we don't know for sure what's going to be with this kid. There may be, quote unquote, something wrong. And that leads to this fear about bringing a child who is in some ways a biological stranger into your home. So these developments have wider ramifications for the question of the children that we embrace, the children that we welcome, even up to and including the issue of adoption. So many possibilities, many ways to engage with children beyond adoption. There are all sorts of other ways people who want to share lives with children can. At one point in families, you would have a couple, let's say, who could not have their own child, who would be the sort of favorite aunt and uncle, who would spend an enormous amount of time with their nieces and nephews. I know one of my brothers and his wife were doing precisely that. So Uncle Rick and Aunt Laurie are the absolute favorites, as you might suspect. Why don't we honor that? I mean, why don't we lift that up as worthy and encourage it? Again, I feel odd even talking about some of this, because I know this is a real sadness for people often. But the drivenness that says you're a failure somehow if you don't have your own biological child, I think is a problematic one because of other possibilities that it forecloses. One more question. Can I take one more? Yes.
Do you see any benefits to gene therapy at all?
Yes, I do. The question is, do you see any benefits to gene therapy at all? The answer is yes. And there it would come under the rubric, and I didn't develop this here because I wanted to set off the alarm bell, but of doing no harm, preventing harm. And there are a range now of interventions that are possible or on the horizon that would, if successful, forestall a life of tremendous sort of medical difficulty for a child. Children who have to spend their entire lives, for example, in sort of protective bubbles and can't look forward to a regular human existence. So the answer is yes. And there, I think we have to take it on a sort of case-by-case basis and think of those situations where the rubric of do no harm would be the rubric that would prevail, by contrast to this genetic enhancement business.
So if one other follow-up. If you could alter a child or a child in utero with Down syndrome, would you argue that that would be immoral?
The question is, if you could alter a Down syndrome child in utero, would I regard that as immoral? You know, let me just say that at this point it strikes me that, first of all, that's given the nature of Down syndrome, that the possibility that one could do that is almost impossible. But second, it strikes me that in fact, if you're proceeding on the assumption that the lives of Down syndrome people are not lives worth living, I think that is an immoral assumption. So I would say if the view is that any pregnancy where you know that it's going to result in a Down syndrome child can and should be altered so that the child doesn't emerge with Down syndrome, because that is a life that is not a life of human dignity and is not worth living. I think that is in fact an immoral assumption. And I guess I have to stop here, but let me just say that you should support the Brownback bill in the Senate. That is the bill that would prevent cloning, because there's now a kind of sophistry going forward that there are two types of cloning, therapeutic cloning and reproductive cloning. There's only one type of cloning. Only one type of cloning. And the notion that once you open the door to unrestrained therapeutic cloning, that surely no irresponsible person would go to human cloning. That I suggest is a forlorn hope, and we shouldn't buy it. Thank you.